There are moments in life that arrive so quietly, you almost miss them entirely. Not with sirens, not with warnings, not with any of the dramatic signals we spend decades preparing ourselves to recognize. They arrive in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, dressed in the ordinary clothes of an ordinary afternoon, and they whisper something so small, so measured, so precise, that your entire body goes still before your mind has any chance to catch up. That is exactly what happened to me on the 14th of March, standing in a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and warm eucalyptus from the floral arrangement someone had placed near the nurse's station. I was 77 years old. I had spent over 40 years of my professional life as a notary public in Launceston, Tasmania, which means I had spent 40 years understanding that the truth of any situation almost never lives on the surface of things. It lives underneath. It lives in the spaces between words. It lives in what people choose not to say, in what they sign and then quietly fold away into a drawer they hope no one will ever open. I thought I had learned everything there was to learn about silence. I had not. Claire looked at me for perhaps 3 seconds. Her hand found mine with the gentle certainty of someone who had rehearsed that gesture many times in her mind before she ever had the opportunity to perform it. Her lips moved. 5 words came out, soft as river water moving over old stone. Please don't accept the first answer. And then she was gone around the corner, and I was standing there holding a container of homemade soup that was growing cold, and a bunch of Tasmanian waratahs with their extraordinary red blooms already beginning to tremble slightly in the air conditioning. And everything I thought I understood about my own family had quietly shifted beneath my feet like river silt after a long rainfall. I want to tell you this story properly. And to do that, I have to go back to the beginning. Not to the hospital, not to that corridor, back to Launceston itself, because this city is not merely the backdrop to what happened. It is, in its own strange and ancient way, one of the reasons it happened at all. Launceston sits at the confluence of the North Esk and South Esk rivers, where they join to form the Tamar. If you have never stood at Cataract Gorge at dawn and watched the light come up over those Dolerite cliffs, then you have missed something that no photograph, however technically accomplished, can adequately prepare you for. The gorge drops away suddenly from the edge of the city, as though the land itself decided to confess something it had been holding back for 200 million years. First Basin opens below you like a secret kept in stone. The suspension bridge sways gently in the morning breeze. And the river, gray-green and unhurried, carries whatever it carries downstream toward the estuary and eventually toward the sea. I was born in this city. I raised my son Adrian in this city. I watched my husband Robert grow old in this city, and I watched him buried in it. I have walked these streets in every season, under every Tasmanian weather pattern the island can produce, which is, as anyone who lives here will tell you, approximately all of them within a single afternoon. I know Launceston the way you only ever know a place you have stayed in long enough to watch it change, and then, somehow, stay the same. The sandstone buildings along St. John Street have that quality. They were quarried and dressed and mortared into place by hands that have been gone for well over a century. And yet, there are mornings when the light falls across those facades in a particular golden way, and the whole street looks almost exactly as it must have looked when the first colonists were still arguing about what to name the river. That continuity matters to me. I spent my career dealing in permanence. Deeds, wills, declarations, the formal recording of intentions so that the future might understand what the present meant. It is work that forces you to believe in the importance of getting things down correctly, because the document that exists in 20 years is the only voice that moment will ever have. That is why Claire's 5 words were so particularly unsettling to me. A notary who has spent 4 decades reading between the lines of legal documents does not easily dismiss a message, constructed with that kind of precision. Please don't accept the first answer. Not wait for me or ask Adrian or even simply help. 5 words chosen with the deliberate economy of someone who worked her entire professional life surrounded by historical archives, who understood better than almost anyone I had ever met what it meant to communicate across a gap of uncertainty using the fewest possible syllables. Claire Holloway, née Drummond, had been my daughter-in-law for 26 years. She had spent those 26 years as an archivist, first at the Launceston Municipal Library, then eventually at the Tasmanian Archive and Heritage Office, where she had developed what I can only describe as an almost reverent relationship with primary documents. She did not merely preserve records. She listened to them. She understood that a document is not just a container for information. It is evidence of a moment when someone, somewhere, believed that something mattered enough to write it down. She had a quality of stillness about her that I had admired from the first evening Adrian brought her to dinner at our house on Margaret Street. Robert was still alive then, still in the habit of staying up past 11 discussing Tasmanian history with anyone patient enough to engage him, and Claire had sat across from him at the kitchen table until nearly midnight talking about the convict records held at Port Arthur and the way certain families had spent generations quietly erasing any formal documentation of their connection to the transportation era. Robert had loved her immediately. I had been slightly more cautious, because I am always slightly more cautious about everything, but my caution had not lasted long. She was not, by nature, a dramatic person, which is precisely why those 5 words had the effect they did. The morning had begun without any indication of what it would become. I had been at home preparing a paper on estate documentation practices for a retired professionals association, to which I still occasionally contributed, and my telephone rang at approximately 9:15. The caller identified herself as a nurse from the private hospital on the hill above the river. She informed me that Claire had been admitted for observation the previous evening, following a period of severe exhaustion. The hospital had my number as next of kin, because Adrian had listed me that way years before, and though the nurse was careful to frame the situation calmly, she mentioned that Claire had asked her to let me know. Not Adrian. Me. I registered that detail the way I had learned to register such things over a career spent noticing what people choose and what they choose not to do. I did not dwell on it. I thanked the nurse, set down the telephone, put the paper aside, made a container of the chicken and barley soup that Claire had always said she preferred above almost any other thing when she was unwell, and I drove across the city through the particular gray-silver light of a Tasmanian March morning, which has a quality of filtered melancholy that I find oddly comforting rather than oppressive. The private hospital is a converted heritage building, which in Launceston means it has thick sandstone walls, high ceilings, windows that open onto a view of the Tamar that must make certain forms of recovery considerably more pleasant than they might otherwise be. I parked beneath a row of peppermint gums and walked to the entrance carrying my soup and my waratahs, and I had not yet reached the front desk when I heard my son's voice behind me. Mom. Adrian is 58 years old and has always had what I think of as a face built for competence. Square jaw, direct gaze, the kind of expression that in professional settings inspires confidence and in personal settings can sometimes be mistaken for emotional distance. He had built his environmental engineering firm over 30 years from a one-person consultancy operating out of our old garage on Margaret Street into a respected practice responsible for some of the most significant bridge restoration projects in northern Tasmania. He was meticulous and disciplined and genuinely passionate about the preservation of historic infrastructure in ways that had occasionally struck his professional colleagues as eccentric, but that I had always found quietly moving. He was standing in the corridor looking entirely calm. That was, I would later recognize, the first detail. Adrian, I didn't know you were here already. I've been here since last night. He reached over and took the waratahs gently, the way he has done since he was old enough to help carry things. She's doing well. Much better this morning. The doctor thinks it's primarily exhaustion, dehydration. She pushed herself too hard over the last few months, and her body finally insisted on a rest. I'd like to see her. something moved across his face, very briefly, the way a shadow moves across the surface of the Tamar when a cloud passes above it, too quick to photograph, present enough to notice. "Mom," she asked not to have visitors today. She specifically asked for quiet. The doctor agreed. She just needs sleep, genuinely. It's nothing more serious than that. And having even a familiar face in the room tends to wake her up and start her talking, and she really does need to rest. It was, as I said, a perfectly reasonable explanation. I have spent my professional life listening to explanations and evaluating their internal consistency, and that explanation was internally consistent. It did not contradict itself. It was delivered calmly and with the appropriate degree of affectionate firmness that a protective spouse might reasonably deploy toward a well-meaning mother-in-law. There was no visible desperation in it, no overstatement, no excess of qualifying detail of the kind that tends to signal fabrication. I almost accepted it. I almost said, "Of course, tell her I came. I'll leave the soup at the desk. Ring me when she's ready for visitors." I had actually formed those words in my mind and was in the process of translating them from thought into speech when a door down the corridor opened and 2 members of the nursing staff wheeled a patient past on a low transport bed, heading toward what the sign on the wall indicated was the diagnostic imaging suite. The patient was Claire. She was lying down, her dark hair spread against the pillow, wearing a hospital gown and looking, I thought, genuinely pale and tired, in the way that people look when their bodies have been insisting on attention for some time. But her eyes were open. And her eyes found me with a speed and directness that told me she had known exactly where I would be standing. The staff were moving efficiently, professionally, giving no indication that this was anything other than routine. Adrian stepped back slightly, not dramatically, not visibly, just enough. Claire's hand came out from beneath the light blanket and found mine as the bed moved past. Her fingers were cooler than I expected. She held my hand for perhaps 2 full seconds, which is long enough, if you know how to measure these things, for a very precise communication to occur. She smiled at me. Her eyes said something entirely different from her smile. And then she said those 5 words. "Please don't accept the first answer." Her hand released mine. The bed continued around the corner. The doors of the diagnostic suite swung quietly shut. And I stood in the corridor with a container of cooling soup and a bunch of waratahs, and my son standing 6 feet behind me, and the whole building seemed, for a moment, to be holding very still. "She looked tired," I said. "She is tired," Adrian said. "That's exactly what I told you." I turned and looked at my son. I have known his face for 58 years. I brought it into the world and watched it change from something small and red and astonished into the composed, competent, controlled face it is today. I know every register of that face. I know what it looks like when he is hiding amusement, and what it looks like when he is managing genuine distress, and what it looks like when he is performing calm, because calm is the most useful tool available to him in that particular moment. I could not read it clearly. That, of all the things that had happened in the previous 10 minutes, was perhaps the most alarming thing of all. "Let me leave the soup at the nursing station," I said, "and the flowers." "Of course," he said. "That's kind. She'll be so pleased." I left them at the desk. I exchanged a brief, pleasant word with the nurse on duty, who had a name badge that read Heather, and who smiled at the waratahs and said Claire would love them. I walked back to my car beneath the peppermint gums. I sat in the driver's seat for approximately 4 minutes without starting the engine. Then I drove home. I want to be precise about my state of mind during that drive because I think it matters for understanding what happened next. I was not panicking. I am not, by disposition, a person who panics. And 4 decades of professional practice in situations involving genuine human complexity had, if anything, further reinforced my natural inclination toward measured response. I was not catastrophizing. I was not building dramatic narratives around 5 words and an exchanged glance in a hospital corridor. What I was doing, very deliberately and with the particular quality of focused attention that I had spent a career developing, was sitting with something I did not yet understand and refusing to either dismiss it or distort it by rushing toward a conclusion. Please don't accept the first answer. Claire Drummond Holloway, whose entire professional existence was organized around the principle that the first document you locate in an archive is almost never the complete story, had looked me in the eye in a hospital corridor and delivered a message encoded with the precision of someone who works every day in the language of unambiguous professional communication. She had not said, "Help me." She had not said something is wrong. She had not said, "Ask Adrian what's really happening." She had said something that was simultaneously more general and more specific than any of those alternatives. She had spoken to me in the register of my own profession. She had told me in 5 words to do what a notary does when the documentation presented at a signing does not quite tell the complete story. Keep looking. Don't stop at the surface. Understand that the first answer is almost never the whole answer. I ate dinner alone that evening on the back terrace, watching the light go off the garden. The lavender along the south wall was still in bloom, which is unusual for mid-March, and the evening air had that particular Tasmanian quality of being both cool and somehow softly textured, as though the atmosphere itself has absorbed some quality of the surrounding landscape. I had poured a glass of Pinot Noir from a vineyard in the Tamar Valley, which felt appropriate given that the valley had become so much a part of how I thought of this part of my life, and I was sitting with Claire's 5 words and turning them over in my mind with the same patient attention I used to bring to a document that didn't quite add up. It was at approximately 8:40 in the evening that I heard the letter slot on my front door open and close. I assumed it was a late mail delivery, which is not entirely unusual in this street, and I finished my glass before going inside to check. The envelope was on the floor of the entry hall, cream-colored, unsealed, bearing my name in a handwriting I did not immediately recognize. No postage. Hand-delivered. Inside was a photograph, black and white, printed on proper photographic paper rather than a digital reproduction, approximately 13 by 18 centimeters. The image showed the interior of what I recognized almost immediately as the Launceston Municipal Library, recognizable by the Federation-era archway in the background and the particular arrangement of the reading room windows. During what appeared to be a formal opening ceremony or reception, 7 adults stood in the frame, most of them smiling, arranged in the slightly self-conscious manner of people who have been asked to hold still for a photograph. Behind them, on a table partially obscured by the arrangement of figures, a blue document case sat in the middle of the frame, apparently unnoticed by the subjects of the photograph. On the front of the photograph, nothing. I turned it over. On the reverse, written in the same careful and unfamiliar hand as my name on the envelope, the photograph doesn't reveal who betrayed us. It reveals who protected everyone. I sat down at the kitchen table. The soup I had not eaten was still in the refrigerator. The waratahs I had kept back, identical to the ones I had brought to the hospital, stood in a vase on the counter. The house was completely quiet, except for the usual sounds of an old Launceston terrace settling into the cool of the night, the particular creak of the hallway floorboards, the distant sound of the river, which you can hear from this street on certain evenings when the city is quiet enough. I looked at the photograph for a long time. Then I went to the study and retrieved the magnifying glass I keep in the second drawer of the desk, which I have owned for 31 years, and which still carries a faint inscription on its handle from the legal stationer who supplied most of the notarial equipment in this city during the 80s and 90s. I placed the magnifying glass over the blue document case in the photograph, and I recognized it. Not the case itself, I had not seen it in many years, but I recognized its construction and its precise shade of Prussian blue and the particular style of its brass fastening, because I had handled a case of exactly that type on exactly one occasion in my professional career, and the circumstances of that occasion had always remained in the back of my mind as one of those small, unresolved professional memories that a careful person keeps without quite knowing why. I had prepared that case. I had prepared it more than 20 years before the evening I was now sitting in my kitchen, turning this photograph over in my hands. I had prepared it as part of a notarial engagement I had been asked to undertake on behalf of a party I was not at liberty to identify, which is entirely normal in notarial practice and which had never, at the time, struck me as unusual. I had prepared the documentation within it. I had certified the signatures. I had sealed it in the proper manner. And then it had been collected by a courier I did not know, and I had never learned what became of it, and I had filed the matter in the way that a professional person files the completed chapters of a long career, with the understanding that most stories do not require the teller to know how they end. But now here was this case. Sitting in the background of a photograph taken at a public ceremony in the Launceston Municipal Library, at some point that my knowledge of that building's renovation history suggested was probably in the early 2000s, and someone had put this photograph through my letter slot on an evening when Claire Holloway was lying in a hospital bed, having whispered 5 words to me that I could not stop turning over in my mind. Please don't accept the first answer. I sat at my kitchen table until nearly midnight. Then I made a decision. I was going to find out what that document case contained. Not because I suspected my son of anything I could name, not because Claire's words had frightened me, exactly, though they had certainly unsettled me in ways I was still measuring, but because I'm a woman who has spent her entire working life in the business of understanding what is actually true rather than what appears to be true. And something about this particular arrangement of facts, 5 whispered words, a hand-delivered photograph, a document case I had prepared myself more than 2 decades before, had the precise internal structure of a situation in which the complete story was something entirely different from the partial story that had so far been offered to me. Somewhere in Launceston, in the archives or the registries or the old council minutes or the institutional memory of whatever charitable trust that blue case had once been built to serve, there was a complete story. I intended to find it. What I did not yet know was how many other people had already been carrying pieces of that story for 20 years, waiting in silence for someone patient enough to finally ask the right questions. And I could not yet know that when the whole truth eventually emerged, it would not look anything like what I was, in those first cautious hours, beginning to suspect. But that night, sitting in my kitchen on St. John Street with a photograph and a magnifying glass and a glass of Tamar Valley Pinot Noir, I was simply a 77-year-old woman in a quiet city, listening to the river, and wondering what it had been quietly carrying downstream all this time without my knowledge. There are things that wait a very long time to be found. Some of them wait because no one was looking, and some of them wait because the right person hadn't yet arrived at the right door with the right kind of patience. I have always been a patient woman, and I was beginning to understand that patience was precisely what this was going to require. I did not sleep well that night. That is perhaps an understatement. I lay in my bed on St. John Street with the photograph on the nightstand beside me and the magnifying glass still resting on top of it, and I watched the ceiling of my bedroom go through its familiar progression from darkness to the deep blue-gray of pre-dawn Tasmanian light. And I turned Claire's 5 words over and over in my mind with the kind of involuntary repetition that is entirely different from deliberate thought. Deliberate thought you can manage, you can redirect it, organize it, set it aside when it is no longer productive. What happened to me that night was not deliberate thought. It was something older than thought, something that operates beneath the level of conscious analysis and simply refuses to be quiet. I have been a widow for 11 years. I have slept alone in this house for 11 years, and I have, over that time, made a kind of peace with the particular quality of silence that an old Launceston terrace produces in the deep part of the night. The house speaks. That is the only word for it. The floorboards contract in the cold. The roof iron ticks and settles. The old sash windows rattle very slightly when a southerly comes up the river valley, which it frequently does in March, when the seasons are in that uncertain negotiation between late summer and early autumn that Tasmanian weather conducts without any particular regard for the calendar. I know every sound this house makes. I have had 11 years to catalog them. But that night, every sound felt different. Not threatening, not ominous. Just present in a way they usually are not, as though the house itself had registered that something had shifted and was, in its own patient structural way, paying attention. At 5:47 in the morning, I gave up, got out of bed, put on my dressing gown, the blue wool one that Robert's sister sent from Edinburgh the Christmas before he died, and that I have worn every morning since. Which is the kind of domestic loyalty that I suspect looks eccentric from the outside, but that feels from the inside like a reasonable arrangement with the past. And I went downstairs to the kitchen and made tea. I put the photograph on the kitchen table and sat down with my tea and looked at it in proper morning light for the first time. Launceston in March offers a particular quality of early morning light that I have never seen replicated anywhere else, though I will admit I have not traveled as extensively as some of my contemporaries. The light comes in from the east across the Tamar Valley, already filtered through whatever morning cloud the weather has assembled overnight, and it arrives at kitchen windows with a diffused silver-gold quality that makes everything it falls on look simultaneously ancient and immediate. Robert used to say it was the light of a place that had not entirely decided whether it belonged to the present or to its own complicated history. He was, among his other qualities, occasionally prone to this kind of observation, which I always found more illuminating than I admitted to him at the time. In that light, I studied the photograph with care. There were 7 people in it. I counted them methodically, which is simply how my mind works after 40 years of professional practice. You do not begin with the dramatic element, you begin with the inventory. 7 people. A mixture of what appeared to be formal and semi-formal attire, suggesting an event of civic significance without the full ceremonial weight of a mayoral occasion. The Federation-era archway in the background was, as I had recognized the previous evening, unmistakably the Launceston Municipal Library. The quality of the light in the photograph, the clothing, the particular style of a woman's jacket visible on the left edge of the frame, these suggested to me, though I could not be certain, a period somewhere between 1999 and 2004. Of the 7 people, I recognized 2. One was Adrian. He was younger in the photograph than I was accustomed to seeing him now, but not dramatically so. Mid-30s, perhaps, which was consistent with the period I had estimated, standing slightly to the right of center in the frame, with that composed, direct expression that has been characteristic of his face since adolescence. He was wearing a jacket I remembered, a dark green linen that he had favored for a period in his early professional years, until it was retired sometime around 2005. The other person I recognized was standing at the far left of the frame, partially obscured by the edge of the photograph, as though whoever had taken the image had not quite managed to include everyone fully. I could see only the profile, strong jaw, gray-streaked hair cropped close, the kind of posture that speaks of someone accustomed to carrying professional authority without requiring any external markers of it. That profile belonged to a man named Douglas Mercer. Douglas Mercer had been, for the better part of 15 years, one of the most respected solicitors in northern Tasmania. He had retired some years before I did, under circumstances that at the time had struck many people in the Launceston legal community as premature. He was, to the best of my knowledge, still alive, living quietly somewhere in the Huon Valley, as I recalled hearing mentioned at some point. We had dealt with each other professionally on numerous occasions and had always maintained the kind of cordial, mutually respectful relationship that is the normal currency between legal professionals in a city of Launceston's size. We were not friends in any intimate sense. But we understood each other's standards, and we had never, in all our dealings, given each other cause for professional mistrust. What was Douglas Mercer doing in a photograph at the Launceston Municipal Library at what appeared to be some kind of civic ceremony? That question, by itself, was not particularly remarkable. Douglas had been involved in a great many civic matters over the course of his career. What was remarkable was the proximity of his image to the blue document case on the table behind the group, and the fact that the handwriting on the reverse of this photograph was something I needed to think carefully about before I could determine whether it was familiar or not. I turned the photograph over again. The photograph doesn't reveal who betrayed us. It reveals who protected everyone. There is a quality of precision in that sentence that I want to draw your attention to, because I think it is easy to read it quickly and absorb only its surface meaning. The word betrayed does not appear in that sentence as a description of what actually happened. It appears as a description of how something might look to a person who has not yet understood the complete situation. The writer is not saying no, betrayal occurred. The writer is saying that the photograph, if read by someone operating only on partial information, might appear to document a betrayal. But the writer is also saying, with equal clarity, that a person who understands the complete story will see something entirely different in the same image. This is the kind of distinction that matters enormously in documentary and legal work. The document that looks like evidence of wrongdoing and the document that is evidence of wrongdoing are frequently the same document. What separates them is context. What separates them is the complete record rather than the partial one. Claire, whose entire professional life was organized around exactly this principle, had sent me a photograph designed to be read in precisely this way. Or had she? I stopped myself. I made a fresh cup of tea. This is something I had learned very early in my career from a senior colleague who had been practicing notarial work in Launceston since before I was born. He had told me once, in his characteristically direct fashion, that the single most dangerous error a legal professional can make is to begin with a conclusion and then read the evidence in its direction. The documents must be allowed to speak first, he said. You are there to listen, not to compose. I did not yet know that Claire had sent me this photograph. I needed to be honest with myself about that. I had assumed it because the timing was extraordinary and because the coincidence otherwise required believing that someone entirely unconnected to the events of the previous day had hand-delivered an archival photograph to my home on the same evening that my daughter-in-law had whispered an urgent message to me in a hospital corridor. My instinct said connection. My training said, instinct is a hypothesis, not a conclusion. I set the photograph aside, and I began, in the methodical way that is simply the only way I know how to begin anything, to write down what I actually knew. Claire was in hospital. She had asked the nurse to contact me rather than any other person. Adrian had attempted to discourage my visit in terms that were reasonable on the surface, but that had produced in me an unease I could not fully account for. Claire had communicated 5 words to me in what appeared to be a deliberate act, performed under constraints that limited her ability to communicate more fully. An envelope had been delivered to my home that same evening, containing a photograph of a civic event at the Launceston Municipal Library, in which my son and a retired solicitor named Douglas Mercer were both visible, and in which a blue document case that I believed I had prepared more than 20 years ago was also visible. On the reverse of the photograph was a handwritten sentence that appeared to reframe the concept of betrayal in terms that implied a more complex underlying narrative. That was what I actually knew. Everything else, the interpretations, the implications, the possible connections, was speculation. And speculation, however sophisticated, is not the same as knowledge. I needed documents. That is always, when you arrive at a point of genuine uncertainty, the answer. Not conversation, not confrontation, not the direct approach that feels emotionally satisfying, but that tends, in situations of this kind, to cause the people you most need to communicate with to become defensive and to stop communicating clearly. Documents, records. The paper trail that Launceston, with its long institutional history and its careful civic culture, was very likely to have preserved somewhere. I knew from my professional knowledge of how charitable trusts are registered and administered in Tasmania that any such trust established in this state would have documentation held with the Tasmanian Registry of Deeds, as well as potentially with the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission, depending on when it had been established and what its operational scope had been. If the Blue Document case had been connected to a charitable land trust, as my first instinct suggested, then there would be a record. There is always a record. That is the thing about Tasmania that people who have not lived here sometimes underestimate. This is a small island with a long, meticulous, and occasionally tormented relationship with its own official history. From the very earliest period of European settlement, through the convict era and its complicated legacies, through the land rights struggles and the environmental battles and all the other defining chapters of this island's story, Tasmanians have been, collectively, either very careful to document things or very careful to make documentation disappear. Both tendencies coexist here, and they coexist in ways that a professional archivist like Claire had spent her career navigating with what I had always admired as an almost forensic elegance. I have to tell you something that I think matters here, and that I want to take a moment to say properly rather than simply folding it into the narrative and moving past it. I have been telling this story to the people who share this channel with me, and I want to pause and acknowledge something. I know that many of you who have stayed with me through the earlier parts of what I have been sharing here have come back because you found in these accounts something that resonated with your own experience of family, of silence, of the particular complexity that comes with loving people whose interior lives you can only partially access no matter how long you have known them. If that describes you, I want to ask you to stay with me and to subscribe if you haven't, because what is still to come in this story is something I think you will not want to come to midway. The full shape of what I found does not become visible until every piece is in place, and the next pieces matter as much as anything I have told you yet. What I am about to describe, the week that followed that sleepless night, was in many ways the most professionally demanding period of my life since retirement. And I include in that assessment things that happened during active practice that at the time seemed impossibly complex. Because during active practice, you have the full machinery of professional standing, institutional access, and collegial support available to you. You have letterhead. You have credentials that open doors that are otherwise closed. You have, in short, the weight of the system behind you. I had none of that. What I had was 40 years of accumulated knowledge about how that system works, who its custodians are, and what questions they respond well to, and what questions cause them to become bureaucratically unhelpful in ways that are perfectly polite and entirely impenetrable. My first call, at 8:45 that morning, was to a woman named Sylvia Oates, who had worked as a records administrator at the Tasmanian Registry of Deeds for so many years that she had become, as far as I was aware, essentially indistinguishable from the institution itself. We had dealt with each other professionally for most of my career. She was not a friend in the way that word is usually meant, but she was a colleague of the particular kind that a long career in a small professional community produces, someone who knows exactly what you are and exactly what you are capable of, and who will therefore give you a level of genuine engagement that she would not extend to someone she knew less well. I told her I was making an informal inquiry about archived records relating to a charitable land trust that I believed had been registered in Tasmania sometime between 1998 and 2005. I described the Blue Document case. I mentioned that I believed I had prepared documentation related to the trust during that period, though I could not immediately locate my own copy of the engagement file, which was true. My files from that era were in storage in the spare bedroom, organized by year rather than by client, and locating the relevant material would take time. Sylvia listened without interrupting. This was characteristic of her. She had the professional stillness of someone who understands that information given before the other person has finished speaking is frequently incomplete. Then she asked me 3 questions. The first was whether I knew the name of the trust. I did not. The second was whether I knew the names of any trustees. I gave her Douglas Mercer, and after a brief hesitation, Adrian Holloway. The third question was one I had not expected. Patricia, she said, are you aware that there was a formal dispute lodged against this trust's registration? I was not. The silence between that question and my response lasted perhaps 4 seconds, which in the context of a professional telephone conversation between two people who have known each other for 30 years is a very long silence indeed. I was not aware of that, I said. There were complications, Sylvia said. I'll need to pull the physical file. These are older records, pre-digitization for the most significant documents. Can I call you back this afternoon? I said she could. I put the telephone down and sat for a moment in the stillness of my study, which faces the small garden at the back of the house, and which receives the morning sun through an old sash window that I have never quite managed to get to close fully on the left side, resulting in a permanent faint draft that Robert and I debated addressing for approximately 20 years without ever resolving the debate one way or the other. A formal dispute lodged against a charitable trust registration. That was not what I had expected to find. I had expected complexity, certainly. I had expected layers. I had, in an inchoate way, expected to discover that something imperfectly resolved lay beneath the surface of the situation I was navigating. But a formal dispute is a specific thing. It is not ambiguity. It is not misunderstanding. It is a moment when someone decided that whatever had happened was serious enough to put their name to an official challenge and submit it to the relevant authority for adjudication. Someone had done that. And then, because I was still sitting in my retired life in my house on St. John Street, rather than having spent the last 20 years managing the consequences, whatever had been submitted had apparently been resolved in some fashion, or set aside, or simply allowed to age in a physical file in a pre-digitization archive until someone came along and asked the right question. I walked to the spare bedroom and began going through the storage boxes. This is not a romantic task. I want to be clear about that. Professional files from 4 decades of notarial practice do not lend themselves to cinematic treatment. They are paper, overwhelmingly, carbon copies, photostats, correspondence, engagement letters, certification forms, notarial certificates, declarations, depositions. All of it filed with the systematic precision that my training demanded and that my character reinforced, organized by year within labeled boxes, each box bearing a date range on a piece of card that I had typed on an actual typewriter for the earlier boxes and printed from a computer for the later ones. I was looking for a period between approximately 1998 and 2004. I found the relevant boxes. I began working through them with the focused attention of a person who knows what a document looks like when it matters, which is a different quality of attention from simply reading. A professional reader of documents develops, over time, a kind of peripheral sensitivity, the ability to register, before consciously processing, that a particular combination of format, signature style, notarial seal, and document construction is significant in a way that most documents in any given archive are not. I was 3 hours into this work, sitting on the floor of the spare bedroom with my reading glasses on and files arranged around me in an expanding semicircle, when I found an engagement record from the autumn of 2001 that made me sit very still for a long moment. The engagement was described, as all my engagement records were described, in the careful, neutral language of professional notation. Client represented by Douglas Mercer, solicitor. Nature of engagement: notarization of charitable trust instruments, certification of signatures, sealing of trust deed, and ancillary documentation. Documents delivered to client representative upon completion. All standard. All exactly as I had described to Sylvia. But attached to the engagement record, clipped with the same small brass clip I had used for supplementary documents throughout my career, was a single sheet of paper that I had no memory of placing there. It was a handwritten note, not in my handwriting, in a hand I did not immediately recognize, though something about the formation of certain letters, the way the capital T was made, the particular curve at the end of the letter Y, produced in me the faint, uncomfortable feeling of almost recognition, the feeling you get when you see someone's face in an unexpected context and cannot immediately locate them in your memory. The note read, Patricia, if you are reading this, then something has finally disturbed the surface. The trust was real, and the intentions were honorable. What happened in between was the kind of thing that good people do when they believe they have no other choice. The full account is where Claire would know to look. She has always known where it is. She was the one who put it there. I sat on the floor of the spare bedroom of my house for quite a long time after reading that. Outside, the March light was moving across the garden in the way it does in mid-morning, touching the lavender along the south wall and making the old peppermint gum at the corner of the fence look, for a moment, almost luminous. I read the note again. Then I read it a third time. She was the one who put it there. Claire Drummond Holloway, who at this moment was lying in a hospital bed above the Tamar River, who had looked me in the eye in a corridor and delivered 5 words with the precision of someone who had been preparing for the possibility of this conversation for a very long time. She knew where the full account was. She had always known. And now I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical in its weight, that her 5 words in that corridor had not been a cry for help in any ordinary sense. They had been an instruction. They had been the beginning of a set of directions that I was only now sitting on the floor of my spare bedroom with a 40-year-old engagement file in my lap and an unsigned note in my hand, beginning to understand how to follow. The question was not what had happened. The question was where she had hidden what she knew about it. And somewhere between the hospital above the river and the archives of this careful, complicated, historically layered city, that answer was waiting. I had always been patient. But I was beginning to understand that this particular kind of patience was going to require something more than simply waiting. It was going to require me to think like an archivist. I have spent a great deal of my life in rooms full of paper. That is not a complaint. It is simply a fact about the kind of work I chose and the kind of person I am. There is something that I have always found deeply reassuring about the physical presence of documents, the weight of them, the smell of aged paper and old ink, the particular silence that collects in rooms where records are kept, as though the accumulated weight of all those recorded moments produces its own atmosphere, its own quality of stillness that is different from any other kind of quiet I know. But sitting on the floor of my spare bedroom that morning, with the engagement file in my lap and that unsigned note in my hand, I was not feeling reassured. I was feeling something that I want to describe as precisely as I can, because I think it matters for understanding what I did next and why. I was feeling the particular vertigo that comes when you discover that a story you thought you knew, not perfectly, not in every detail, but in its essential shape, turns out to have an entirely different essential shape than the one you had been carrying. I had known, in the general way, that a mother knows the broad outlines of her adult son's professional life, that Adrian's firm had been involved in significant restoration work across northern Tasmania throughout the early 2000s. I had known that he had worked on historic bridges. I had known that some of that work had been connected to broader civic renewal projects in the Launceston area. These were the kinds of things that came up at family dinners, that were mentioned in the local paper, that formed the comfortable background texture of a son's professional life as experienced from a parent's appropriate distance. What I had not known was that any of that work had been connected to a charitable land trust. What I had not known was that Douglas Mercer had been involved. What I had not known was that someone, and I could not yet determine who, had at some point found it necessary to walk into my spare bedroom, locate a specific engagement file from the autumn of 2001, and place a handwritten note inside it. A note that had been waiting there, apparently, for however many years had passed since it was placed, waiting for exactly this moment when I would come looking. She was the one who put it there. I turned the note over, nothing on the reverse. I held it up to the light from the window. No watermark, no indentation from a previous page, nothing that would help me identify when it had been written or by whom. The paper itself was not particularly old, not the yellowed quality of the engagement file it had been attached to, but it was not new either. It had the slightly softened feel of paper that has been handled and then left alone for some years. I put it carefully to one side and returned to the engagement file. A notarial engagement from the autumn of 2001. I closed my eyes for a moment and tried to locate the memory, because 40 years of professional practice means thousands of engagements, and most of them do not leave strong individual impressions. They are processed, completed, and filed with the professional efficiency that the work requires. But occasionally, an engagement leaves a residue, a small persistent memory that does not entirely follow the file into storage. And now, with the file in front of me, I found it. I remembered Douglas Mercer's office. Not his main office on Brisbane Street, where he conducted his regular practice, but the secondary rooms he maintained in a building further along the street, which I had always thought of as his archive rather than his workplace. A space where older matters were kept, where he retreated for work that required a particular quality of concentration. I had gone there twice in my career, and the second occasion had been in the autumn of 2001. I remembered that the meeting had been brief. Douglas had been, as always, precise and unhurried, which was a quality I had always respected in him. He had explained the nature of the engagement in broad terms: charitable trust instruments requiring notarization, signatures requiring certification. And he had been equally precise about what he did not wish to discuss, which is also, in legal work, a form of communication. I had done the work. I had certified what I was presented with. I had asked no questions beyond the professional minimum, because that was appropriate, because that was how such engagements work, and because nothing in what I was shown gave me cause for concern. I had been presented with the blue document case at the end of the meeting. I had placed the certified documents inside it. Douglas had sealed it in my presence, and then a courier, whom I did not know, had arrived and collected it, and that had been the end of my involvement. What had been inside those documents beyond the portions I had directly certified? I could not reconstruct that fully from the engagement record. The file contained my own notarial certificates and the corresponding records as I was required to keep them, but not copies of the underlying instruments, which were the client's property and not mine to retain. I needed to think about this differently. If Claire knew where the full account was, and the note in my file said she did, said she had always known, said she was the one who had placed it there, then Claire had known about this situation for a significant period of time, long enough to locate a full account somewhere, long enough to decide that this account should be preserved somewhere specific, long enough to understand that its preservation might one day matter in ways that the present moment could not fully anticipate. Claire was an archivist with access over the course of her career to some of the most significant institutional repositories in Tasmania. Where does an archivist hide something that needs to be found eventually, but not prematurely? I thought about this for a long time, sitting on the floor with the morning light moving slowly across the spare bedroom carpet. And then I thought about something else, something that Claire had said to me once, at dinner, perhaps 4 or 5 years ago, in the way that she sometimes said things that seemed like general professional observations, but that I now found myself re-examining through a different lens. We had been talking about the nature of archival work, about the difference between preservation and concealment, which is a distinction that sounds simple and is in fact enormously complex. And Claire had said something that had stayed with me not because it seemed significant at the time, but because it had the quality of a well-made sentence. The best place to preserve something you want found by the right person is always inside the collection where that person would know to look. The safest archive is always the one that the right reader already knows how to navigate. I had thought she was talking abstractly, about her work, about the general philosophy of archival practice. I was no longer confident she had been talking abstractly. Sylvia Oates rang me back at shortly after 2 in the afternoon. I had spent the intervening hours going through the rest of the relevant storage boxes, making notes in the careful longhand that is still, for me, faster and more reliable than any electronic alternative when it comes to the kind of thinking that needs to proceed at the pace of a pen rather than the pace of a keyboard. By the time the telephone rang, I had filled 4 pages of the legal pad I keep in the study desk and had assembled what felt like the beginning of a framework, still incomplete, still with significant gaps, but with enough internal structure to suggest that I was at least asking approximately the right questions. Sylvia's voice had a quality I recognized from our professional dealings. She was being careful. Not evasive. Sylvia was not, in my experience, capable of evasion, but careful in the way of a person who has opened a file and found something that required her to think before she spoke. "I've pulled the records," she said. "The trust is registered as the Tamar Heritage Restoration Trust, registered in 2001. Principal purpose: the preservation and restoration of heritage infrastructure in the greater Launceston area, with particular emphasis on historic bridge structures and associated riparian heritage." Adrian's area. Exactly Adrian's area. "The founding trustees," Sylvia continued, "were 3 individuals: Douglas Mercer, solicitor; a woman named Rosalind Hargreaves, who I believe was at that time chair of a local heritage council; and your son, Patricia. Adrian Holloway." I wrote the names down, though I had already known 2 of them. "The dispute," I said. Sylvia was quiet for a moment. "The dispute was lodged in 2003, she said, 2 years after registration. It was a formal challenge to the trust's governance structure, specifically to the manner in which certain decisions about trust property had been made without the recorded consent of all trustees." "Who lodged it?" Another pause. "That's the part that took me a moment," Sylvia said, "because the dispute was eventually withdrawn in 2004. So the file contains the initial lodgment, a period of correspondence, and then a formal withdrawal notice. The resolution is documented as an internal governance matter resolved between trustees without further regulatory involvement." "Who lodged it, Sylvia?" "Rosalind Hargreaves," she said. "The 3rd trustee." I wrote the name down again. Rosalind Hargreaves had lodged a formal dispute against the governance of the Tamar Heritage Restoration Trust in 2003 and had then withdrawn it in 2004. And somewhere between those 2 dates, whatever had happened had been resolved, or had appeared to be resolved, in a manner that did not require further regulatory intervention. "Is Rosalind Hargreaves still in Launceston?" I asked. "I have no way of knowing that," Sylvia said, which was true and which was not an evasion. "But Patricia, the reason I wanted to be careful when I rang you back is that there's something else in the file, attached to the withdrawal notice." She paused again. "It's a statutory declaration, signed by all 3 trustees, and it references a sealed document held in trust, not as a legal instrument of the trust itself, but as a record of the circumstances surrounding the dispute and its resolution. The declaration states that this sealed document is held by a named custodian and is to remain sealed unless the circumstances described in the document come to pass." The room was very quiet. "What circumstances?" I asked. "That's not specified in the declaration," Sylvia said, "only that the custodian would know." "And who is the named custodian?" I already knew what she was going to say. I think I had known since the moment she began describing the statutory declaration, because there is a certain internal logic to a situation like this, and once you understand its logic, the individual details begin to follow from each other with a kind of quiet inevitability. "Claire Holloway," Sylvia said, "née Drummond, at that time employed by the Launceston Municipal Library." After I finished the call with Sylvia, I sat in the study for a long time. The afternoon was doing what Tasmanian March afternoons do, shifting between warm sunlight and a cool southerly in a way that makes the light in the room change every few minutes, brightening and then softening again, as though the day cannot quite make up its mind. I have always thought that this quality of Tasmanian light reflects something true about this island, that it is a place that does not commit easily to any single atmosphere, that holds multiple possibilities in tension with each other without resolving them prematurely. That seemed, at this moment, an apt observation. Claire had been the custodian of a sealed document since at least 2004. She had held it, was holding it now, presumably, through 20-plus years of family life, 20-plus years of marriage to Adrian, 20-plus years of dinners and holidays and conversations and all the ordinary texture of a shared life. She had known something that Adrian either did not know she knew, or knew she knew, and had chosen not to discuss. And she had been carrying that knowledge with the archival discipline of someone who understood that certain documents must be preserved intact until the moment they are needed. And she had been carrying, I now understood, whatever weight that kind of custodianship imposes on a person. I thought about Claire with new attention. Not as my daughter-in-law, not as the familiar figure at the end of the family table, but as someone I was perhaps only now beginning to see clearly. She had spent 20 years working every day in the company of other people's records, other people's secrets, other people's carefully documented truths. She had developed, over those 20 years, an extraordinary capacity for patient professional stillness. She had never, in all our family interactions, seemed burdened. She had never seemed to be carrying anything she had not chosen to carry. I had admired that quality without fully understanding it. Now I wondered whether what I had admired as professional equanimity was something more complicated. Whether she had been, for 2 decades, a woman in the middle of a situation she had not created and could not fully resolve, maintaining her equilibrium with a discipline that I now found both humbling and, if I am honest with myself, slightly heartbreaking. She had asked the nurse to call me, not Adrian, me. I was beginning to understand what that meant. She had been waiting. That was the word that kept returning to me as the afternoon light shifted in the study. She had been waiting for a moment, perhaps a specific moment, perhaps simply the right confluence of circumstances, when it would be appropriate to allow the sealed document to serve the purpose for which it had been sealed. And something about her current situation, something about what was happening now, had told her that moment had arrived. What was happening now? I had been so absorbed in the documentary investigation, in the engagement file, in the call with Sylvia, in the growing framework of names and dates and institutional records, that I had not spent enough time thinking about the most immediate layer of the situation. Claire was in hospital. She was being described as suffering from exhaustion. Adrian had attempted, in a manner that was reasonable enough on the surface, to prevent me from seeing her. I needed to speak to someone who could tell me more about Claire's actual situation. Not the hospital version, not Adrian's version, but the version that a person who had known Claire well, over a long period, in a professional context, might be able to offer. I thought of one person immediately. Her name was Frances Alderton. She was 62 years old and had worked alongside Claire at the Tasmanian Archive and Heritage Office for the better part of 15 years. They had what I would describe from the outside as a friendship of genuine mutual respect. Not the intimate confiding kind, not exactly, but the kind that develops between two people who work closely together through significant professional challenges and who come, over time, to understand each other in ways that are different from, but not less real, than social friendship. I had met Frances perhaps 6 times over the years. She was a careful, self-contained woman with a quality of attention that reminded me of Claire, and that I suspected was not a coincidence. That working closely with Claire for 15 years had perhaps shaped her in certain ways, or perhaps they had recognized in each other a similar orientation toward the world, and that recognition was what had made the friendship. I rang Frances at 4 p.m. She answered on the second ring, which told me she had been expecting a call, though not necessarily from me. "Patricia," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not surprise, but was also not quite ordinary. "Frances, you've heard about Claire." "Adrian rang me this morning," she said, "to let me know she was admitted. He was very calm about it. He was very calm about it when I saw him at the hospital yesterday as well, I said. Francis, I need to ask you something directly, and I want you to know that I am not asking in any spirit of alarm. I am asking because I have spent 40 years learning that the most useful thing a person can do when they do not fully understand a situation is to ask the clearest possible question of the person most likely to know the answer. Ask, Francis said. Has Claire seemed different to you recently, in the months before this admission? The pause that followed was long enough to be its own kind of answer. She's been, Francis chose her words with care. She's been going through something. I don't know the full shape of it. She's not a person who tells you the full shape of things before she's certain of them herself. But yes, in the last 6 months, perhaps a little longer, something has been sitting differently on her. Did she say anything specific? Not directly, but there was one afternoon, about 3 months ago. We were working late on a cataloging project, and everyone else had gone home, and we were the only 2 people in the building. And she said something. Francis stopped. I've been trying to decide since yesterday whether to ring you about it. Tell me. She said, and I'm giving you the words as exactly as I remember them. She said, Francis, do you think the right time to tell the truth about something is always obvious? Or do you think sometimes you have to manufacture the right moment because otherwise it never comes? And then someone came back into the building for a forgotten coat, and the conversation ended, and we never returned to it. I held the telephone very still. Do you think sometimes you have to manufacture the right moment because otherwise it never comes? Claire had been thinking 3 months ago about how to create a moment. She had been thinking about timing. She had been thinking about what it would take to bring something to the surface that had been submerged for a very long time. And now she was in hospital, and she had sent for me, and 5 words in a corridor and a photograph through a letter slot and a 23-year-old engagement file with a note in an unfamiliar hand had already brought me further into the interior of this situation than I suspected anyone had anticipated I would reach this quickly. I thanked Francis. I told her I would be in touch. I put the telephone down. I sat in the study as the last of the afternoon light left the window, and the room went to the particular soft gray of a Tasmanian early evening. And I thought about what it means to manufacture a moment, to decide that the circumstances that would allow a truth to emerge will not arrive on their own and therefore must be constructed, to arrange things deliberately, to send a specific nurse to make a specific call to a specific person, to whisper 5 words in a corridor with enough precision that those 5 words would function as the first instruction in a set of directions that only the right person would know how to follow. Claire had manufactured this moment, and she had manufactured it knowing that I would come to exactly this point in the inquiry. Because she knew my training, she knew my professional instincts. She knew that I would not stop at the first answer. What she had not known, what she could not have arranged, was what was in the spare bedroom, the note in the engagement file. Because if she had placed that note there, she would have known I would find it. But the note said she was the one who put it there, meaning the full account, not the note itself. Someone else had left that note in my file. Someone who knew about my engagement. Someone who had access to my storage. Someone who wanted me to know that Claire held the key to the sealed document, but who had not been in a position to tell me directly. There were not many people who could have placed that note in my filing system. There were, in fact, almost no people who could have done it. The circle was much smaller than I had initially thought. And as the evening came down over the garden and the lavender along the south wall went from purple to shadow, I realized I was no longer simply looking for what had happened inside a charitable trust 20 years ago. I was looking at a situation in which multiple people, my son, my daughter-in-law, a retired solicitor, a former Heritage Council chair, and apparently at least one other person whose identity I had not yet established, had each been carrying a piece of a story for 2 decades, in silence, each one holding their portion of the weight, none of them apparently willing or able to put it all down at once. The question I had been asking was, what happened? But there was a prior question that I had not yet asked properly. Why, after 20 years, had the moment come now? What had changed? I was still sitting with that question when I heard at 7:40 in the evening a knock at my front door. Not the letter slot this time. A knock. 3 times, deliberate and unhurried, the knock of a person who has decided to do something and is not going to be uncertain about it. I went to the door and opened it, and found, standing on my front step in the cool March evening, a woman I had not seen in many years. She was older than I remembered her, but then, I suppose we all are. That is the quiet arithmetic of time. It operates on every face simultaneously, without preference, without exception. And there are moments when you encounter someone after a long absence, and the years between you become suddenly visible all at once, collapsed into a single confrontation with how much has passed. Rosalind Hargreaves was, by my calculation, somewhere in her late 60s. She had been a striking woman in her professional years, the kind of person whose authority announced itself before she had said a word, through posture and eye contact, and the particular quality of attention she directed at the world around her. That quality was still there. But it was accompanied now by something I had not previously seen in her. A tiredness that went deeper than the physical, the kind that accumulates not from a single difficult period, but from years of carrying something that could not be set down. She was wearing a dark coat and carrying a small bag. She looked at me the way a person looks when they have rehearsed an arrival many times in their mind, and the actual moment of it is both exactly what they expected and utterly different. "Patricia," she said. "Rosalind." I stepped back from the door. She came inside. I did not ask her how she had known to come. I did not ask her where she had been, or how long she had been in Launceston, or how she had found herself on my doorstep on this particular evening. I had spent 40 years learning that there are moments when questions interrupt something that is already in the process of happening on its own terms, and this was one of those moments. I simply led her to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and sat down across from her at the table where I had spent the previous 2 evenings with the photograph and the magnifying glass and my slowly accumulating understanding of what was underneath all of this. She looked at the photograph, which was still on the table. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. Something moved across her face. Not surprise, not grief exactly, but something in the territory between them that I did not have a precise word for. "I wondered if it would eventually come to this," she said. "How long have you been back in Launceston?" "I arrived 3 days ago," she said, "when I heard about Claire." "How did you hear about Claire?" She looked up at me then. "Because Douglas told me. He rang me. He'd been informed somehow. I think through the hospital administration, though I couldn't tell you exactly how. And he rang me within an hour of Claire being admitted." She paused. "We've been in contact, Douglas and I, throughout all of these years, not frequently, but consistently, the way people stay in contact when they share something they cannot fully explain to anyone else." The kettle boiled. I made the tea. I put a cup in front of her and sat back down, and she wrapped both hands around it the way people do when they need something solid to hold, and I waited. "Where would you like me to begin?" she asked. "At the beginning," I said. "The actual beginning, not the 2001 version, not the 2003 version. The beginning." She nodded slowly, as though she had expected this and had, over the previous 3 days, been preparing herself for it. What Rosalind told me over the next 2 hours filled in the outline that Sylvia's records and my own engagement file had sketched, and it filled it in with the kind of detail that only a participant in events can provide. Not the documentary version, not the institutional version, but the lived version, with all its texture of individual motivation and imperfect decision-making and the particular quality of moral complexity that arises when good people face circumstances that do not offer any clean alternatives. The Tamar Heritage Restoration Trust had been conceived in the late 1990s in response to a situation that was genuinely urgent. Several of Launceston's historic river bridges, not the famous ones, not the postcard structures, but the smaller, older, functionally important bridges in the secondary roads and riparian paths of the Tamar Valley, were deteriorating at a rate that neither state nor local government budgets could address. A small group of people who cared deeply about what those structures represented had decided to act. Douglas Mercer had provided the legal architecture. Rosalind, as chair of the Northern Tasmania Heritage Council, had provided the civic legitimacy. Adrian had provided something that neither Douglas nor Rosalind had: the technical expertise to understand what restoration actually required, and an emerging professional reputation that could attract the kind of institutional partnerships that would make the trust financially viable. They had registered in 2001. They had spent the first year building relationships, identifying priority structures, securing initial funding from a combination of private donors and a state heritage grant. Everything had been correct. Everything had been documented. Everything had been done in the way that people who care about doing things properly do them. And then, in the winter of 2002, a problem had emerged. Not a dramatic problem. Not a corruption or a crime or anything that carried the weight of deliberate wrongdoing. Something quieter and, in many ways, more difficult to navigate than anything dramatic would have been. One of the Trust's primary donors, a man named Jeffrey Crane, who had made a significant fortune in Tasmanian aquaculture and who had committed a substantial portion of it to the Trust's first major project, had encountered severe financial difficulties. His commitment to the Trust was in the form of a pledge rather than a transferred asset, which meant that when his personal financial situation collapsed, so did the Trust's projected funding for the restoration of a bridge on the South Esk that had already been partially contracted. The contractors had been engaged. Materials had been ordered. Heritage approvals had been obtained through a process that had taken 18 months and was not repeatable in the short term. And the Trust was facing the prospect of defaulting on commitments it had made in good faith, with consequences that would extend well beyond the Trust itself, to the contractors who had reorganized their schedules, to the heritage community that had supported the project, and to the broader credibility of private heritage restoration initiatives in Tasmania. Adrian had found a solution. It was, Rosalind said, a solution that was technically legal. It involved redirecting funds from a secondary trust account, one that held reserves designated for a future project, to cover the immediate shortfall. The intention was to replace those funds within a specified period from alternative sources that Adrian believed he had secured. The action had been taken with Douglas's knowledge and with Douglas's legal review, but it had not been presented to Rosalind as a trustee decision requiring her formal consent before it was implemented. When she had discovered it, 6 months later, she had been furious. Not because the funds had been redirected. She understood the reasoning, and she understood, intellectually, that the alternative had been a public failure that would have damaged something she had spent years building. She had been furious because she had not been consulted, because the decision had been made around her rather than with her, because 2 of her fellow trustees had determined, in the privacy of their own professional judgment, that speed was more important than process, and had acted accordingly. She had lodged the formal dispute. She had lodged it not because she wanted to destroy the trust, but because she needed the record to reflect that what had been done improperly, regardless of the outcome. She was a woman who had spent her professional life in heritage work precisely because she believed that process matters, that the way things are done is not separable from what gets done, and she could not let the precedent stand undocumented. "What happened when you lodged it?" I asked. Rosalind set down her cup. Douglas came to see me within a week, and then Adrian came. Separately, not together. Douglas was formal, professional, as he always was. He explained the legal position, acknowledged that the process had been irregular, and proposed a mechanism for documenting the situation and the resolution in a way that would protect everyone, including me, he was careful to say, including me, while allowing the trust to continue its work. She paused, and Adrian came and sat in my living room and said almost nothing for a very long time. And then he said that he was sorry. Not the professional version of sorry. The genuine one. The one that doesn't try to justify anything. She was quiet for a moment. I had known Adrian for several years by then. I knew what he had built. I knew what he genuinely cared about. And I knew that what he had done had come from a real place. Not from selfishness, not from any desire to benefit personally, but from a particular kind of responsibility that he had felt towards something larger than the correct procedure. He had been wrong. He knew he had been wrong, and he was not trying to talk me out of knowing it. I thought about my son. I thought about the face I had watched for 58 years, and the particular quality of it when he was carrying something difficult and doing so, as he always did, in the manner of a person who has decided that bearing it quietly is the only appropriate response. "Why did you withdraw the dispute?" I asked. "Because of Claire," Rosalind said. I had not expected that answer. I had expected her to say that Douglas had found a satisfactory resolution, or that the statutory declaration had provided sufficient accountability, or that she had decided the trust's continuing work outweighed the procedural failure. Any of those answers would have been consistent with what I already knew. "Claire was working at the municipal library," Rosalind continued. "She was not, at that point, as directly involved in the archival work she later became known for. She was still building that part of her career. But she came to see me, on her own, without telling Adrian she was coming, as far as I know, though I cannot be certain of that." Rosalind turned her cup slowly on the table. She had found out about the situation through something she came across in her work. I don't know the precise details of how. She didn't tell me, and I didn't ask. But she came to see me, and she sat where you're sitting now, and she said something that has stayed with me for 20 years. The kitchen was very quiet. She said, "Rosalind, I'm not here to ask you to drop the dispute. I'm here to ask you what outcome would genuinely satisfy what you need this to have been. Not what would make it comfortable, what would make it true." I sat very still. That was Claire. That was exactly Claire. The precision of it, the refusal to offer false comfort, the absolute commitment to identifying what was real rather than what was convenient. "And what did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her that what I needed was a record. A complete record, sealed if necessary, that documented what had actually happened. Not the sanitized version, not the version that protected everyone's professional reputation, but the actual sequence of events, with all the decisions and all the reasoning behind them laid out clearly. I told her that I could accept the withdrawal of the dispute if the truth was preserved somewhere in a form that would survive all of us. And she said she would be the custodian. She said she would be the custodian, Rosalind confirmed, and she kept that promise for more than 20 years. That document exists, Patricia, and Claire has always known where it is. I refilled both our cups. Outside, the night had settled fully over the garden. The lavender was invisible now. The peppermint gum at the corner of the fence, just a darker shape against the general darkness. The Tamar was out there somewhere beyond the city streets, carrying its unhurried tons of gray-green water toward the estuary, indifferent to the conversations happening in kitchen windows along its banks. "What changed?" I asked. "Why now?" Rosalind looked at me steadily. "Because Jeffrey Crane died 6 weeks ago." Jeffrey Crane, the original donor whose financial collapse had set everything in motion. "He died without having resolved something," Rosalind said. "He recovered financially over the years, not to his previous position but sufficiently. And for the last decade, apparently, he had been attempting to rectify what he felt was his responsibility, his pledge to the trust, which had never been formally discharged. He had been in contact with Douglas. He had wanted the trust to be formally registered again, properly, with updated governance, and he wanted to make a final contribution that would amount, with interest, to something very close to his original commitment. The trust had lapsed. It had been wound down quietly in 2006, when the bridge work was substantially complete and the funding situation had made ongoing operations impractical. But Jeffrey had never stopped feeling the weight of his original commitment. And before he died, he instructed his estate solicitors to proceed with whatever was necessary to honor it posthumously. Rosalind paused. Which means the trust needs to be reestablished, which means all the original documentation needs to be reviewed, which means the sealed record that Claire has been holding for 20 years is no longer simply a private archive of what happened. It becomes relevant to a formal legal process. And there it was. The reason the moment had arrived. Not because anyone had decided to manufacture a crisis, not because Claire's health had created some kind of artificial pressure, but because the external circumstances had shifted in a way that made the sealed document not merely a matter of personal conscience, but a matter of formal legal necessity. The document needed to come out of wherever Claire had put it. And Claire, who had known this day would come eventually, had been carrying the weight of that knowledge for weeks, perhaps months, as the news of Jeffrey Crane's death and the intentions of his estate had made their way through the legal community. She had been working out how to handle it, what the right sequence was, who needed to know what, and in what order, how to bring something into the open without causing the kind of damage that could have been avoided if it had simply been open from the beginning. That was the weight Frances had seen on her. That was the thing sitting differently on her in recent months. She had been exhausted not merely by overwork, but by the particular exhaustion of a person who is trying to navigate something complex and delicate and 20 years old while maintaining, around that navigation, the ordinary surface of a life. She needs to tell Adrian, I said. Not me, not Douglas. Adrian needs to know the full account before any formal legal process begins. I know, Rosalind said. I think that's why she sent for you. She needed someone who could see the whole picture first, someone who could be with her when she tells him. I sat with that for a long moment. My son had made an imperfect decision in a difficult situation 20 years ago. He had been wrong about the process. He had been right about the outcome. The bridge on the South Esk had been restored, beautifully, and it was still standing, still in use, still part of the living landscape of the Tamar Valley. He had spent 20 years not knowing that his wife had been the custodian of the full account of what had happened. He had spent 20 years in a marriage that contained, without his knowledge, a sealed document about his own professional conduct. I thought about what that meant, about what Claire had carried, and why. Not to protect herself, I understood now. To protect something more fragile than professional reputations. To protect the capacity of two people to build a life together that was not permanently defined by the worst decision either of them had ever made. She had carried it because she loved him, and because she was, in every professional and personal fiber of her being, a person who understood that some documents must remain sealed until the moment arrives when their opening will illuminate rather than destroy. The following morning, I went back to the hospital. Adrian was there, as I had expected. He looked, I thought, slightly less composed than he had been the day before. Not dramatically, not in any way that a casual observer would have noticed, but in the way I notice after 58 years. I need to speak to Claire, I said, and I need you to be there. Something moved across his face. Not fear, not guilt. Something more complicated than either. The look of a person who has been waiting for a conversation they have long known was coming, and who is, in the final moment before it begins, not certain whether they are relieved or terrified. All right, he said. Claire was sitting up in bed when we came in. The Waratahs I had left at the nursing station 2 days before were in a vase on the windowsill, their red blooms still vivid against the gray silver of the morning Tamar outside the window. She looked, I thought, better than when I had last seen her, not fully recovered, but something had shifted in her expression. The weight that Frances had described, the thing sitting differently on her, was still there. But it was accompanied now by something else. Relief. The early, tentative, almost not yet real relief of a person who has decided that the thing they have been carrying is about to be put down. She looked at Adrian first, and then at me. "Patricia," she said. And that was all she needed to say to me, my name in her voice, with everything it was now carrying. "I know most of it," I said. "Not all, but most." She nodded. She reached for Adrian's hand, and then she told him. "I am not going to give you every word of what passed in that hospital room, because there are things that belong entirely to the people who were present for them, and that do not need to be shared more widely to be understood. What I will tell you is that Adrian listened. He listened the way he had always listened to things that mattered, with complete stillness, with the kind of focused, unwavering attention that in his professional life had made him exceptional, and that, in this moment, made him something I found difficult to name. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "You kept that all this time." "Yes," Claire said, "to protect me." "Not only that," she said, "to protect what was true. Those aren't the same thing, but they were both worth protecting." He looked at their joined hands for a moment. "I was wrong about the process," he said. "I knew it then. I've known it every year since." "I know," she said. "That's in the document, too." Everything is in the document. 3 weeks later, on a morning of extraordinary Tasmanian autumn light, the kind that comes in mid-April when the deciduous trees in City Park have begun to turn and the whole of Launceston goes briefly golden in a way that seems almost improbable for a southern island city. We gathered in the Heritage Reading Room of the Queen Victoria Museum and Art Gallery. Adrian and Claire. Douglas Mercer, who had driven up from the Huon Valley and who looked, in person, exactly as his profile in the photograph had suggested, older, quieter, but with that same quality of composed professional gravity. Rosalind Hargreaves, sitting beside him in a way that spoke of two people who have shared something significant for a very long time. Sylvia Oates from the Registry of Deeds, who had come not in an official capacity, but simply because she had been part of finding what needed to be found. Frances Alderton, who had brought with her a stillness that felt like the right thing to bring to a room like that on a day like that. And me. Claire opened the sealed document herself. It had been, as I had eventually understood it must be, in the archive she knew best, not hidden, exactly, but filed with the precision of a professional archivist among the holdings of the Tasmanian Archive and Heritage Office, catalogued under a reference that would be meaningful to someone who knew what to look for and invisible to anyone who did not. The document was 43 pages long, handwritten in Claire's careful, clear archival hand with supporting documentation attached. It described, in precise and dispassionate detail, everything that had happened. Every decision, every reasoning, every consequence, every conversation that the participants had consented to have recorded. It was, I thought, one of the finest pieces of documentary work I had ever encountered, not because it excused anything, but because it refused to excuse anything while also refusing to condemn. It simply recorded. It gave every participant their full complexity. It let the truth exist in all its imperfect, human, well-intentioned, incorrectly executed reality. Geoffrey Crane's estate solicitor had a copy within the week. The process of re-establishing the Tamar Heritage Restoration Trust, with updated governance documents that reflected everything that had been learned, began formally in May. Douglas, who had more archival energy than his retirement suggested, offered to assist. Rosalind agreed to serve in an advisory capacity. Adrian, who had spent 20 years restoring the bridges of the Tamar Valley without fanfare or public recognition, was asked to consult on the structural assessment of 3 additional heritage structures that Geoffrey Crane's posthumous contribution would fund. He accepted. I went to Cataract Gorge on the morning after the gathering at the Queen Victoria Museum. I went alone, early, before the tourists arrived, and while the light was still that particular quality of early morning silver that makes the Dolerite cliffs look as though they are made of something more ancient than stone. I stood at the edge of First Basin and looked down at the water. I was holding the photograph, not because I needed to look at it again. I had looked at it enough times by then that I could have described every detail from memory. but because it felt right to have it there. Because the photograph had been the beginning of a thread that I had followed across 3 weeks and 20 years of other people's quietly carried history, and I wanted to stand at the end of that thread with the beginning of it in my hands. The bridge that Adrian's firm had helped restore 20 years ago was visible from where I stood. It was a modest structure, not the famous suspension bridge that appears in every photograph of the gorge, but a smaller, older span further along the reserve, built in the Federation era and restored with the precise, respectful care that my son had always brought to everything he worked on. It was carrying, that morning, a middle-aged man walking a large, very enthusiastic dog who showed no interest whatsoever in the heritage significance of the structure beneath his feet. I found, to my surprise, that I was smiling. Because that is what a restored bridge is actually for. Not for photographs, not for heritage plaques. For someone to walk across on an ordinary morning with their dog, not thinking about it at all, simply moving from one side to the other as though it had always been there and always would be. The work endures, even when the people who did it were imperfect, even when the process was flawed, even when the truth of how it came to exist was sealed away in an archive for 20 years, waiting for the right moment. There is something in that, I think, that is worth holding on to. Not as an excuse for imperfect processes. Rosalind was right to insist that process matters, and I believe that still. But as a reminder that the full accounting of any situation is almost never available at the moment when the situation is occurring. We make decisions with what we have. And sometimes, if we are fortunate, the people who love us are patient enough to hold the rest of the story until we are ready to hear it. Claire came home from the hospital on a Wednesday. I brought soup, the same chicken and barley that I had brought to the hospital 2 weeks before, which had by then become a kind of private joke between us. The soup that had started everything, the soup that had gone cold in a corridor while 5 words changed everything I thought I understood about my family. We sat at her kitchen table, the 3 of us, and we had dinner, and we talked about ordinary things for a while. About the trust and its re-establishment, about the bridges, about Rosalind, who had decided, after 20 years in the Huon Valley, that she might come back to Launceston after all. At some point, Adrian went to make coffee, and Claire and I were alone in the kitchen for a moment. She looked at me across the table. "You found it," she said, "faster than I expected." "You left a very clear trail for someone who knew how to look," I said. She smiled. Not the smile from the hospital corridor. Not the one that said something different from what her face was doing. This one was complete. This one had nothing underneath it that contradicted it. "I knew you would," she said. "That's why I asked them to call you." I have thought about that conversation many times since, about what it means to be trusted in that particular way. Not as a problem solver, not as an authority, but as a person whose way of moving through the world is trusted to find what needs finding, without being told exactly where to look. I am 77 years old. I have been a professional in this city, a wife in this house, a mother to one careful and imperfect man, and a mother-in-law to a woman I did not begin to fully understand until she whispered 5 words to me in a hospital corridor. I have learned over those years that the most important stories are almost never the ones that announce themselves. They are the quiet ones, the ones carried in sealed documents and old photographs and unsigned notes in filing systems that nobody has opened in years. The ones that require a particular kind of patience to find, and a particular kind of honesty to receive, and a particular kind of love to have held intact across 20 years of ordinary life. If you are watching this, and you have stayed with me through all 4 parts of this story, then you already understand something important. That the first answer is almost never the whole answer, and that the people we think we know completely are almost always holding something we haven't yet had the patience to reach. Please, if this story has meant something to you, leave a comment below. Tell me what it made you think about. Tell me what you will carry from it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel, because I have more stories to tell, and every one of them begins the same way, with something that looks simple on the surface and turns out, when you look carefully enough, to be something else entirely. The river is still out there, still carrying what it carries, still moving toward the sea, and I am still, after all these years, learning to read the water.